guys, it's Dawn Woolslegel, and today I wanted to give you a closer look at our Merriest Wishes stamp set. Now this is a new style for us, something we're trying out, and I think it's a lot of fun to color, especially with Copic markers. Now I am no Sandy Allnock or Kathy Raskusen, however, I'm going to give you some tips on creating this fun background and getting some depth with your Copics. This is one of two sets featuring these fun little elves, and this is Carter Elf, and we're going to be using the one here where he's sitting on top of the tree getting ready to put a star on top. To make sure I stamp this straight, I'll be using the Fisker stamp press. I'll use the lines on my grid mat to get it straight, and then I'll just pick it up with that press. This is a great tool for ensuring that your images are straight. I'll be stamping this in Memento dye ink in Tuxedo Black. This is my preferred ink for Copic coloring when I don't want it to bleed or blend or smear. I'm using Bristol Board by Canson. This comes in a large 11 by 14 inch pad of paper, and I use it for my traditional illustrations, but it's great for Copic coloring. It takes the color really well and it holds up to lots of layers. It has a smooth side and a slightly textured side. I prefer the slightly textured side. And now we can start our coloring. This is one of my favorite color combinations for Caucasian skin, the YR000 and the E00. And then I use the E70 for shadows and shading. I'm going to start by laying down a complete wash of the YR000. Sometimes I start with my darker, my shadows first, and then I come over those with my lights and then my midtones, and sometimes I do start with the light. It all just depends on what I'm doing. I like skin to be nice and even, so I usually do start with the lightest color and doing a complete wash first. So now I'm just going to go into fast motion and let you watch how I color all of this in. Once I've got that initial wash down, I'm going to come in with my midtones, and for that I'm using the E00. And I'm going to hit his ears, up under his hairline, around his jawline, across the bridge of his nose, right under his nose, and then right under his lip. Then I'm going to take the E70 and I'm going to scribble some onto an acrylic block, and I'm going to get that paper saturated with that E00, and then I'm going to pick up some of that E70 with the Copic marker off of the block and blend it just to get a little bit of darker shadow. I don't want too much, I just want it to be very soft. Scribble the excess off, and then in some areas I'm going to go straight to him with that E70 in the spots where I'd want it darkest. I'm going to do this sparingly. Now this elf is modeled after my youngest son Carter, and he had very blonde hair as a baby, so we're using Y32 and then E70 for our shadows. We really don't need too much variation in color here. It's such a little area. So I'm going to start by laying down that Y32, and then I'm just going to come in with the E70 and add some shadows to kind of suggest some curls or some waves in here. Again, there's not a lot of real estate here to color, so I'm just going to go over this a couple of times and try to get some movement to show up in there. Now I didn't feel like I was getting quite the depth I wanted, so I'm going to use E47 to just add a couple of really deep shadows. And again, I'm going to use this very sparingly. I'll be using R24, R29, and R89 to do his hat, his shirt, and the stripes and his stockings. So I start by laying down that base of the R24, and then I'm going to come in with my midtone, the R29. I'm going to add that around the trim of his hat, where the hat tucks in and gathers together for that little, I don't know, that little puff ball at the end. And then following the curves in the hat, I'm going to make it look like the hat is actually divoted and it has some rises and falls to it so that it looks a little more organic and it doesn't look so stiff and flat. For the shirt, I'll start the same way. I'll lay down a base of my light color. And I always turn my paper. I find that I have more control coloring away from myself than I do toward myself, so I like to turn my paper. Now I'm going to come in with that midtone and add some shadows. And I like to leave a little light spot. Anytime you have like his arm there, you can see that I left a little edge of light spot on the back side and the underside. Because when you have something that's round, the light will actually reflect and come from behind, and you will get a lighter edge around both sides. A lot of people like to take that shadow all the way up to the line, but it just looks more realistic if you leave that lighter edge. I'm going to continue laying down my midtones and my darks and then blending them together with my light. And then anywhere I think that I need an extra little bit of shadow, I'm going to come in and deepen it up even more. I use that same color combination on his little mittens there. And you'll notice in this image I've left the right side a lot brighter than the left side, and that's because that star, we're going to be coloring it and making it all glittery and sparkly, and it's going to be like it's shining, and so it would make the whole right side of him much lighter. So now it's time to color the whites, and for that we'll be using N0 and N1, and we're not actually going to be coloring the whites, we're going to be adding all of the shadows and the shading. And coloring white is actually one of my favorite things. I know that seems odd. I don't know. I really enjoy coloring and painting in particular white objects because I think it's so interesting because they're really, even white things have color in them. They have specks of yellows and blues and grays and purples, and they're never really truly, truly stark white. So it's fun to see how real I can get it to look. But here we're going to be using a simple gray shading and shadowing. Now we can do our blacks, his boots and his belt, and for that we'll be using C3 and C7. And you'll notice that we're not actually using black, even though we're going to be coloring black objects. Um, if we did it in just straight black, you would see no detail, you would get no shine, and it would look quite flat and boring. By doing it this way, it's going to appear overall black, and the gray is going to look like highlights, and it's going to give it much more depth and much more interest. So even though we didn't ever actually use any black on these boots, they look black. Now for the tree, we'll be using my favorite almost Kelly green color combo, G21, G24, and G28. To do the tree, I do it a little bit differently. You'll notice that I'm not laying down a full wash. I'm using a flicking motion. And what this is going to do is it's going to vary the amount of ink that the marker lays down in any one spot. It's going to look much more realistic. Now I'm coming in with that medium tone, and I am creating separation between the light and the dark. It's going to serve as a reminder for me where I want to make sure I retain my light and where I want to go darkest. It's going to make that bottom layer look like it's underneath that top layer. Now I'm going to keep coming in and alternating between my light and my midtone, and I'm going to keep adding flicks of color. I'm not being too precise. The only thing I'm making sure is to keep that separation between that bottom and top layer there. Now I can add in my deepest, darkest one, and I'm just, again, adding those random flicks. This is going to give the illusion of pine needles. I'll keep repeating this until I am satisfied with the way it looks. Now we're going to create that snowy watercolored looking background using Copic markers and Blender solution. So here we're going to start by laying down this B91, and we're going to cover a square block, similarly to the way that we would do watercolor when we tape off the edges and we have that nice thick white border, except for here we're just going to color out to create that block of color and leave that white border. And I'm not being overly careful to get this all nice and smoothly blended because I'm going to create lots of texture and uneven color by using the clear blender solution anyway. So my goal here is just to get down that block of color. Once we've got all that color down, we're going to use our Copic solution and a stiff bristled paintbrush to come in and just create some mottled texture in that background. You can see I'm not being precise. I'm just picking up some of that solution with the brush and then just dabbing it onto the background. Now we're going to add all of our snowflakes using a very stiff bristled brush. You could also use a toothbrush for this, and some Distress Paint in Picket Fence by Tim Holtz. And for that, I'm just going to pick up the paint and start stippling it onto the picture in random spots. You can also use your finger to run them across the bristles of the brush, and it'll create really fine mist-like sprays. And this will give you a variation in the size of the snowflakes. To create that super sparkly golden star, we're going to be using the help of a Wink of Stella pen. In fact, that's all we're going to be using to do it. I've used the clear one a lot, and I do have the gold and the silver, but I have yet to use them until this project. And I found that it's perfect. You don't need to lay down a base color or anything. It's nice and pigmented and gives a great sparkly shine, just like the clear one, but this one has a base coat with it as well. So, yay, great for shortcuts once and done. I just went over the whole star using that nice brush tip. It's perfect for coloring and it comes to a really fine point, so I had no problem getting into the points of these stars either. And that was all I had to do for that. To add back in the whites of his eyes and his button where I accidentally covered over them, I'm just going to use a Sakura Jelly Roll pen here to add in those those really bright white spots again. So again, the highlights in his eyes and then the buttons on his shirt. And then while I was at it, I decided to add some super bright white snowflakes. The picket fence, because the brush was wet, it diluted the color a little, which was kind of nice because now I have these different depths of snowflakes. The lighter ones that are mixing with the blue that are fading into the background look out of focus and further away, and then I can add some really bright ones that look like they're really close up in focus and super bright. It just adds a lot of depth to this image now. And make sure to add some snow on top of the star, on top of the elf, so it looks like the snow is falling in front of him as well and not just behind him. And that finishes up this background. We'll just wait for all this to dry and we can add our sentiment. It doesn't take very long, but that white gel pen, you don't want to smear it, so just wait for that to dry. So now I'm using my embossing buddy pad just to prepare the surface so that no stray embossing powder sticks where I don't want it to. And I'm going to stamp this using Versamark ink. It's super sticky, so this embossing powder will have something to stick to. I'll tap off the excess and then I'll use my heat gun to heat set it. This is going to create a really bright white raised sentiment, and it'll really stand out from that background and that super saturated image. I've cut the panel down and I'm using foam tape to adhere that to the front of my card base, and this is a dove gray cardstock. I like to use something that's obviously different and not bright white because we're working on watercolor paper and it's not a true white. And there you have just one way to color this image. All of these images are generously sized, so they're a lot of fun to color. You could even try watercoloring these or using different techniques. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. Remember, you can find the featured Wplus9 supplies at Wplus9.com. You can also connect with us on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day. Bye!